I want to introduce Geoff Moore. He's the author of so many great business books. Crossing the Chasm is, of course, the first big book that everybody here knows about. Inside the Tornado, another awesome book that builds on Crossing the Chasm. Dealing with Darwin, Living on the Fault Line, Guerrilla Game, Escape Velocity, and his most recent book, Zone to Win, which he's going to share advice today. He's a venture partner, at Wildcat Ventures, Moore David Howe, partner at the Chasm Group. Here's his Twitter handle. And, Zone to Win came out 7 years ago. So he's going to get us up to date on what we've learned about innovation since then. So with that, Geoff, welcome.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And, to my view, the product manager is kind of the center of the high-tech universe. So I really like to have a chance to reconnect. It's certainly where Crossing the Chasm came from originally. I've get kicked up to the C-suite as the Peter principle goes. So I haven't been as close to product management in the last couple of years as I would like. So it's lots of fun to be here today. So this Zone to Win book, if you haven't heard about it, it's kind of like Crossing the Chasm for grownups. I mean, the deal was, how do you catch the next wave? And it's like, well, you're catching a wave. Well, Crossing the Chasm is about catching a wave. But the next wave is actually a different problem than catching your first wave. And that's because you now have an established business to deal with as well as the future. And it creates something that Mark Benioff taught me to call a crisis of prioritization. The book was written with Mark's team at Salesforce and Satya Nadella's team at Microsoft. So really, really, really good teams dealing with this issue of how do you catch the next wave. The zone management philosophy, we'll talk a little bit about it during this thing, but it's in the book. It's basically, you have to zone your enterprise in a way so that you can deal with conflicting priorities, and we'll talk about how to do that. And then the rest of the book's about best practices for the various four zones in the thing. So you say, okay, great. It's been out for 7 years. What's new? Well, weirdly, part of what's new is what's very, very, very old. So what happens is you get inside an established enterprise, and a lot of people don't know the technology adoption life cycle. So I spend a bunch of time with people often early on saying, guys, let me just remind you that when there's a disruptive innovation that comes into any marketplace ever, and it's truly disruptive. So in other words, it's going to cause people to have to really either rip and replace or migrate or do whatever. People adopt it at various points in its technology adoption lifecycle, and the personas on the right illustrate those types. Sheldon's our technology enthusiast. They want to get in early. Visionaries want to be first also because they want to be disruptive. They want to be the disruptor. Pragmatists do not want to be the disruptor. They often are, but they also don't want to be the disruptee. So what they're doing is they're always checking with each other. Where is this thing in the life cycle? Do I have to react to it yet or not? And what we're going to see with the next slide is that they postpone, then they postpone, and then they postpone, and then they jump in. And we'll talk about that in the next slide in a second. Conservatives are later to adopt. And historically, for the first 20 years of my career, we didn't pay any attention to conservatives because they had to get whatever the pragmatists gave them. And in the license and maintenance model, once you were licensed in there, it was very, very hard for people to switch. But in the last 20 years, with the rise of SaaS, now the conservatives becoming a much more important constituency because of retention and attrition concerns. We want people to become conservative with our stuff once that they've adopted it. And so the whole customer success movement, the product experience, product-led growth, all those things are actually the land is with pragmatists, but the expand can be with both pragmatists and conservatives. So they become more important constituency, and we're paying a lot more attention to them now than we ever did before. And there's always skeptics. And the skeptics are they're just saying, "Nah, you guys are instruments of the devil." So anyway, you look at how this thing plays out over time, and the key idea here, and this is really important for product managers. We've talked about this the last couple of times I was on the podcast here, on the webcast here, is this pattern of adoption creates 4 inflection points in the catching of this sort of development of the wave of the next generation technology. And the first one we call the early market. And that consists of the technology enthusiasts and the visionaries. And they're people who believe what you believe. And so it's enormous fun. Particularly if you're at a startup, it's really fun because, you're all part of one happy band. But the whole point about the early market is you need to put your new disruptive technology on the map. And the way you do that is you win marquee references. And by marquee, I mean like Fortune 500 type companies who will like go deeply in. A visionary a sponsor there is going to go all in with you. You know, kind of the way the CIA went all in with Amazon very early on in its situation. There was Merrill Lynch that went all in on Salesforce early on in their history. You know, you're looking for those kinds of people, and you'll do whatever it takes to make them successful because they're kind of your lighthouse account, flagship account type of thing. And you can get as many project-like customers as you want in the early market, but it doesn't scale. So what you want to get is the pragmatists. But the pragmatists are, at this point, they're not ready to buy in yet. They're still saying, well, let's wait and see. I need to see more proof. I need to see more references, whatever. And so you say, well, how do you get people that are kind of like standing on the sidelines? How do you get them into the game? Because they don't believe what you believe. And what we realized with Crossing the Chasm was, okay, what you got to do is find people who need what you have. In particular, we called these people pragmatists in pain. They have use cases that they cannot solve with their existing technologies, and they're under increasing pressure to solve them. And so the whole key there is to take those early cohorts and develop loyal kind of niche customer bases around high-value use cases that are urgent to be solved. In particular, that head bowling pin, that very first beachhead market, you want to just go after one market to cross the chasm, not two or three or four, just one, and just nail it. Once you nail the first one, then you can kind of scale it into adjacent use cases and adjacent market segments and go forward. And at this period in the life cycle, it's still use case driven. It's not yet about you. It's not about your technology. It's about these various use cases. But at some point, what happens is enough use appears that people go, well, hang on, this isn't just for two or three or four use cases. This has got very broad horizontal implications. That's what we call the tornado. And in the tornado, people do not say we believe what you believe. They don't even say we need what you have. What they say is, we want what they have. So this is the pragmatist thinking of, this is the FOMO moment for pragmatists, fear of missing out. So the chasm is fear of going too soon, but the tornado is fear of being left behind. And so what you want to do in the tornado is capture market share as fast as you can, because here's what's unique about the tornado. For the first time, the prospects for the new technology have budget already allocated for the category. That wasn't the case in the early market, certainly, and it wasn't the case in the bowling alley. In the bowling alley, they had budgets, but they were budgets for the old stuff, or they were budgets for Band-Aids, but they weren't budgets for the new category. But in the tornado, there are now budgets, and that's why. And when people have budget, they spend budget. So if you're in a tornado, you have to capture market share. This is your time. It's like you're one of those fishermen in a school of tuna. You just got to get the tuna into the boat, because you're going to establish market share status during the tornado. If you're number one, you're going to be the gorilla. Number two, you're going to be chimp number one. But you get down to chimp number two, and then after that, it's pretty much monkeys all the way down. And it's not like a monkey doesn't do well in a tornado, but you don't get the ecosystems and the marketplaces form around the leaders. They form around the gorilla primarily, and typically chimp one's got a pretty good shot at it. And after that, it's kind of dicey. So Jack Welch at GE used to say, be number one, be number two, or don't play. And that's what he was referring to. But then finally, we're talking about, because we're moving into the SaaS world, where now it's not just landing, because you can think of tornado as kind of landing. It's a lot about expanding. And so now we want to get people who say, well, they may not want what they have, but they need what they have. And so basically they're saying, look, this is an opportunity to capture wallet share via upsell and cross-sell. This is where product-led growth can come in. This is where the customer success management team could potentially become a renewals group, or that kind of stuff. So it's a whole new dynamic. Now, the point of this exercise is each one of those four inflection points puts a very different pressure on your product and on your product management. So in the early market, you highlight the technology and you build services around it on a project basis. Sometimes you do non-recurring engineering. You just do whatever it takes. In the bowling alley, you subordinate your product to the use case. which is really kind of weird because you've been thinking about the product all along. It's like, no, it's the use case, stupid, because nobody knows about your company. They don't know who you are, but they do know about their use cases. And you become initially famous for the use case, the way the Macintosh became famous for desktop publishing. Obviously, as we all know today, it's a lot more than that, but that's how they crossed the chasm. The tornado, though, that's the hyper competitive. That's when you're it's all the knives are out. Every product's going against every product, and you've got to largely on price, performance, and feature function. This is the feature function product centric time in the life cycle, and where you really want to just win on competitive comparisons. You want to win the demo. You want to win the bake off, all that kind of stuff. And then Main Street is much more about maintaining a relationship, an ongoing relationship with the end user community as you expand. And you want to make sure that you both address their issues so that they don't trit out, but also that they're getting continual value. So that's it. So the point about this exercise is when you look at this from the point of view of a large company or an established enterprise, they have their core businesses, everything they report out to the street, all their earnings reports, all that kind of stuff. That's all about their tornado and Main Street stuff. All of the cool new stuff is in the next generation businesses, but they're subscale. They don't make money. In fact, they lose money. And the bowling alley may not lose money, but the problem is those niche markets are too small, given the fact that the enterprise itself is so large. And so you have this real problem of how do you serve all these different priorities within a single enterprise? I mean, the first time when you were a startup, you went serially along those four things, which was challenging enough. But now you're going to try to go back to the beginning and still maintain the back half of the curve. That's a lot of different conflicting imperatives. How do you do that? And so that's where the zone of the management framework came from. What we ended up saying is, look, you want to kind of divide up the landscape into sustaining innovations, which is the core businesses, and they're on the right, and next generation businesses, which are disruptive, and they're on the left. And in both cases, what you care about is when is it mission critical and when is it potentially enabling. So in the case of your core business, the mission critical sustaining thing is make your plan. This is stuff that's in the tornado or on Main Street. You're making what you're selling what you're making. It's a very results-oriented thing. This is what you report out in the earnings report. This is what drives your stock price. This is what drives your power in the ecosystem. This is where you deliver your value to the world in the performance zone. And so we know a lot about that, and everybody on this call knows a lot about that. If you've ever worked in a public company or even a private company that's gotten to the performance zone. Now, for that zone to work, there's a whole set of stuff that has to happen behind the scenes in order for the performance zone to perform. I mean, you got to have a finance team, you got to have an HR team, you got to have an IT team, you got to have, if you have a product, you got to have manufacturing, procurement, supply chain, you need customer support, you need customer success, you need marketing, you need, just everything, right? It's all cost centers. And that zone is there to make everybody else more successful. And they use a shared services model to make all these different lines of business in the performance zone and all these different sales territories in the performance zone successful. They're not a results-oriented zone. It's much more of a process-oriented zone. They want to get better every quarter. They're always trying to be continuous improvement going forward. And those two zones in a large company, it's 90% plus of the head count. It's 90% plus of the budget in normal times. I mean, this is your business, right? But because we're now in an age of disruption, and digital transformation is transforming not just tech, digital transformation is transforming everything. So all of a sudden, it's not just tech companies now that have incubation zones. Finance companies have them. Retail companies have them. Car companies have them. We see it all over the place. So what are they doing? Those zones have a charter to say, look, there's a bunch of this disruptive innovation coming along. It doesn't all apply to us. We have to figure out which ones are the ones we need to potentially, which are the ways we might want to catch, and frankly, which are the ways we can let pass by. So in order to do that, you have to get enough familiarity with the next generation opportunity to make that call. And you can't do this. You can't do it from the sidelines. You got to get out of the playing field and test it out. So basically what the incubation zone is about is essentially like, how can you create these startup-like operating units inside a publicly held company, but apart from the performance zone and apart from the productivity zone? And so how do you do that? And basically what the book talks a lot about is VCs do this very well. They have a very different financial model. You can't copy their financial model, but you can copy their operating model. How does a VC actually fund a startup? How do they manage them? How do they reward them? You can do a lot inside a large company to copy that and to get that sort of agile, lean startup, fast failure, find out really quick kind of capability. And I would submit to you that those three zones now exist in most large corporations, certainly if they're in a sector that's been disrupted. So not just tech, although I think all of tech would have these three zones, but I think a lot of other industries as well. Like our friends at Sam's Club, who are in retail, that are recruiting people on this call. That Sam's Club's got an incubation zone that they need to staff. Now, there's a fourth zone, and it is not populated. And that's because normally you do not want to be in a transformation. Transformation puts your entire enterprise at risk because you're essentially going to shift resources out of an established line of business, could be getting a little bit long in the tooth, a little bit old, but it runs and it works and it's predictable. And you're going to take those resources and put them into a transformational business, which is not yet proven and which is still not quite to scale. And so this is when you are going to catch the next wave. It is an act of daring. And frankly, the key idea there, it will create a crisis. And you cannot have anybody in the company not row in the same direction or paddle in the same direction if we're going to be on a surfboard, because this is rapid, dramatic change and you have to get through it. The whole key to a transformation is you must not stop in the middle. And so once you start, you can't stop. That's why it's mission critical. You cannot stop in the middle of a transformation. Many, many companies do, and that's why there are 56 companies are listed in the front of Zone to Win as companies that either don't exist anymore or are a shadow of their former selves, because every time they got into the transformation zone, they would get halfway in and the things look so awful that the metrics look terrible. And so they would just quit or they would get cold feet. You can't do that. So those are the four zones. Each zone has its own mission. It has its own horizon, and it has its own management model. And I would say in general, the key learning that we've learned in the last 7 years here is most of my clients thought they were supposed to have something in the transformation zone all the time. And I've spent most of the last decade trying to say, no, transformation zone is a dangerous, dangerous place to be. So if you want to be a disruptor, you better be a very charismatic, Elon Musk, Reed Hastings, Mark Benioff. You got to be somebody who can carry the entire company on your leadership. Most people in the transformation zone, we realize, are playing what we call zone defense, not zone offense. They are the disruptee, not the disruptor. And what they've realized is if we do not do something dramatic, our performance zone business, which is directly being attacked by the next generation disruptor, we're going to be a Kodak. We're going to be a Business Week. We're going to be in real trouble. And so they transform, and it's the same problem. You still have to catch the next wave. You still have rapid, dramatic change. You still have to have these very challenging performance metrics, but you're doing it because you're under duress. You've got to do it. So in the case of the book, Salesforce was a disruptor, and Microsoft was a disruptee. And then we talked about both of them, how they did it. Okay, so what else did we learn? Well, the other thing we learned is, that life cycle model, it's kind of a fit for this model. So if you say, well, if it's in the early market or crossing the chasm, and you're in a larger company, and when I say a large established company, I think you've got $3 or $4 billion worth of revenue. You're not tiny, but you don't have to be $100 billion. But you have to be enough. You're funding everything out of your core business, and now you want us to do something new. And what this says is, not only do you incubate in the incubation zone, you actually cross the chasm in the incubation zone, which seemed kind of weird to me the first time. But the reason why it's important is the performance zone in a $3 billion company, it has to operate at scale. It can't do niche market development. It just can't. It's got too many constituencies, and it's got to have too much sales coverage. It's got too many partnerships, et cetera. So you actually need to take a route to market and put it under the control of the general managers of these little units in the incubation zone and let them act just like a startup. So you actually use the Crossing the Chasm playbook in the incubation zone with your own Salesforce. Now, you're not going to keep that Salesforce. Once you get into the transformation zone and you say, okay, we're now going to go into tornado state, if there's a tornado coming, then you're going to actually transfer all of that capability during that transformation zone out of the incubation zone into the functional orgs of the performance zone. You're going to go to your global sales force on the go-to-market side, and you're going to put the product line in your product, general product capability organization, your engineering and product development organization. The transformation zone is when you go to scale. And the reason why it's so challenging is it's not yet profitable, it's not yet proven, and you've had this very proven, very profitable business. So all of your shareholders, all of your stakeholders, they're used to seeing you grow at a good rate, but not an amazing rate, but a very profitable rate, and you're a solid company. Now all of a sudden you have the transformation zone, amazing growth rates, but all over the map, not predictable yet. Your margins haven't settled down yet. You really don't have partnerships. It's really, really challenging. And if you measure the transformation zone by performance zone metrics, it looks like it's failing. That's why all those companies quit. But the fact is, it's not failing. It's morphing. It's kind of like adolescence. You're not a little cute little grandchild in the incubation zone, and you're not a solid, respectable adult in the performance zone. You're this sort of morphing individual that in the transformation zone. And you're not that easy to love, but it's very important to get through, and nobody gets through without being an adolescent somewhere along the line. Then there's the performance zone. The performance zone, God love it. The tornado, if you have a tornado in the performance zone, you're the happiest salesperson on the planet. And you, as a product manager, you think you're God's gift to the planet. But most of the time in the performance zone, you're actually on Main Street, meaning you're working out the next 5, 10, 15 years of the history of this product category. Eventually it'll get disrupted, and eventually you'll have to go into the productivity zone where you'll either go to end of life or some kind of renewal, or also you can have a laboratory in the productivity zone. It's actually doing R&D that you're going to maybe feed into the incubation zone. But I think this was a learning that we had, which is the technology adoption lifecycle in the zones. It's not a perfect match, but it's pretty good. And the big insights were cross the chasm in the incubation zone. I think that was a surprise to me, and I think it was a surprise to some of my clients. This isn't a big surprise, but I just want you guys to think about it as product managers, because I'm going to ask you in a minute, which zone do you think your product's in? And the kind of talent you need in each zone is really quite different. The performance zones, you want athletes in the performance zone. They want to win the game. They got to. The reason they think fast is they got every 90 days that they get. You have to report out the quarter. Every year you got to report out the year. It is like the Super Bowl. There's no overtime, and sometimes there isn't the Super Bowl, but not in business. So you have to think fast, and that means you're making calls under competitive challenges that you don't have the time to do a study or whatever. You gotta just do your best to win. Whereas the productivity zone is about saying, look, we don't measure ourselves quarter by quarter. We do measure ourselves for the long term. And therefore, we're going to think twice and cut once, and measure twice, cut once kind of thing. So we're going to think slow. And there's actually quite a good book by a guy named Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which makes it very clear between the sort of intuitive decision-making in the performance zone and the more analytical decision-making in the productivity zone. Two very different cultures. They're always a little bit at each other, banging at each other a bit. But the combination of think fast, think slow is really key to maintaining a large existing franchise on a global basis. Incubation zone, our friends at Apple taught us think different. It's exactly what you think it is. If you've ever been in a startup, you know what this is about. If you're an engineer, this is what you often love to do. You're not necessarily economically You don't even know if it's going to be economical at the beginning, but you're very excited about it. And your job is to actually kind of contradict the conventional wisdom in the performance zone and in the productivity zone. You really want to be actually not antagonistic to them, but you're actually contrarian to what the current conventional wisdom is. And then the transformation zone, you just have to get through. And you think of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, he had an amazing number of things that he gave the industry, but one thing, most of which we can't copy because he was just so remarkably talented himself. But one thing he taught that you can copy is when you're under a transformational pressure, there's no second thing. He used to say there's only, at Apple, we do one thing. And so when it was the iPod, it was the iPod. He didn't talk about the Macintosh. It was all the iPod. When they introduced the iPhone, you never heard about the iPod again in your life. It was all iPhone. And then at the very end of his life, when he introduced the iPad, it was the iPad. So staying focused is really key there. And so again, as a product manager, as you look at the team you're working with and the kind of where things are, want to make sure that you're whatever zone you're in, you've got the right talent base for it. And then one last one, and this is probably the biggest learning. So what you realize, it's obvious, except that people don't rock it, which is every one of these zones has a different set of metrics because every one of these zones is being measured to a different outcome. So if you look at the performance zone, it's all the metrics that you see in most executive comp plans, right? Bookings versus plan, revenue versus plan, contribution margins. You could put a market share competition in there if you wanted. It's all the results oriented metrics, and most people in the performance zone feel like, well, yeah, real men use these metrics, and every other zone is they're all wusses. We're the tough guys. But the truth is, those metrics are good for that zone, but they're not good for the productivity zone. Productivity zone is all about ratios. It's all about that. The way you improve quality or process improvement is you measure it and then you try to improve it by some percentage. So percent yield on a manufacturing floor, scrap and rework, that kind of stuff. Net promoter score, I'm trying to jack it up. Marketing qualified lead to sales qualified lead to converted sales pipeline conversion rates. It's all about analysis and ratios. And, the Toyota mantra was better, never best. That's what you're doing there. So it's a very different set of metrics and really important. You don't want to create contests in the productivity zone about number of leads generated, because that's a performance zone metric, not a productivity zone metric, and vice versa. You don't want to talk about the performance zone in terms of percentage of ratios because, hey, did you make the quarter or did you not make the quarter? All we care about is the score at the end of the game or the end of the quarter. So very, very different metrics there. The incubation zone has a third set of metrics. Now, you do measure revenue, but it's not for revenue's sake because the revenue isn't significant as revenue. It's a pittance, but it's significant in terms of telling you whether you're getting product market fit. If you're winning customers under competitive conditions, and with a product in the incubation zone, that is a signal that you are on the right track. You're getting product market fit. If you can win marquee early adopters who can go all in on a very special project basis, again, this is something that you would never, this is not the contract you would sign in the performance zone, but you would definitely sign it in the incubation zone because you want those marquee early adopters and you will go the extra mile in a way that you would not with your core business. And then can you cross the chasm? Can you find those repeatable use cases? That's a really key metric in the venture capital community. And it's a key metric for the incubation zone because now you have something that can be scaled. You have something that an ecosystem can form around. You can build going forward. So very different metrics. And if you use performance zone metrics in the incubation zone, you'll shut everything down after a few quarters because it's not getting the metrics you want. If you use productivity zone metrics, you'll also beat them up because they're not following a process. They don't have a process yet. They're still trying to discover things. So it's not time for process. So 3 very different sets of metrics. And then the fourth one is, are you transforming? And transformation is weird, but basically, is this thing getting to a sufficient scale that it can be part of your performance zone going forward? Are you getting over the tipping point? Because remember, like when Amazon went into cloud computing, you're thinking, well, first of all, when they went into retail for books, you thought, really? But when they went into cloud computing, you thought, okay, Jeff's lost it, right? But the point is, if you can get to a tipping point, then all of a sudden people will go, whoa, who knew? Amazon, the leader in cloud computing, clearly. And of course, what your stock price goes through the roof, and you too get to be a billionaire, a gazillionaire, or whatever it is that Jeff or Elon or all these guys are. Okay, the point about this exercise, and this is probably my favorite takeaway from this thing, is remember, what gets measured gets managed. Well, guess what? What gets mismeasured gets mismanaged. And I think the number one thing I would ask you as a product manager is make sure you're being measured by the metrics of the zone that you're in. Do not let metrics from another zone affect your decision making. And by the way, don't try to impose your metrics on the other zones either. I mean, in other words, it's a two-way street. It's incredibly, most failures of innovation-oriented, disruption-oriented things inside large corporations occur because the executive team has inadvertently used the wrong metrics from the wrong zone. So it's incredibly important that you zone your enterprise and zone your F, which is a way of saying, look, there's 4 ways we do things around here, not one. And each zone's got to be accountable to its own governance model. Each zone has its own performance metrics. Each zone should have its own comp model. It's just really, really important. And you organize the zones actually during the annual budgeting process. And one of the key ideas there is you want to allocate the budget by zones before you allocate it by business unit or by initiatives. In other words, you never want to have somebody in the incubation zone competing for budget with somebody in the performance zone. In fact, you don't want anybody in the performance zone competing for budget with the productivity zone or vice versa. So what you want to say at some point is, well, how much money did we spend in each zone last year? You got to zone your business. Okay. All right. Now, do we want to spend more or less in that, percentage wise? What do we want to do? Okay. Lay it out. Now, you tell that's the bucket of money this zone's going to compete for, and we're not going to let the other 3 zones poach on that bucket. That's for that zone only. So that's kind of a key idea. So zones interoperate; they don't merge it. And so this is just for you as a takeaway. I really think it's important as you're thinking. In fact, it'd be fun in Q&A when we come to Q&A. If you have a thought about where is the product? If you are a product manager, where is your product in this framework? If you're not a product manager, if you're a marketing manager or sales or an investor or whatever, where is your enterprise? Where's the key product line for your enterprise? Where is it? Where are we with that going forward?
I have a poll ready to go if we want to ask people with the 4 zones. You want to do it real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
So everyone should see a poll coming up. Say, which zone is your product in?
This is
yeah. I'll share the results as soon as we're done.
And by the way, productivity zone it's kind of nearing end of life. You're kind of optimizing the heck out of it. You're not investing in any more R&D. You're just kind of, squeezing the last juice from the orange.
I'll share the results.
That is very cool. That is very cool.
Should be able to see. So 52% incubation.
Yeah, and by the way, that's not surprising to me. I think people that kind of self-select into your podcast, Dan, I think that they tend to be incubation leaders. I mean, so I think it's really cool. Okay. 10%
feel like they're in the transformation zone. So great. All right, cool.
The other thing that I wanted to do was a tool came out of the last 6 months of working with a wonderful client and very large corporation, $50 billion corporation. And they have product lines. They've got lots and lots of products. So the question in the performance zone becomes, well, I've got all these products. Where should I be spending my money? And, we all read the peanut butter manifesto from Yahoo, right? So we know that peanut buttering across the entire product line, everybody gets, quote, their fair share, is a guarantee of mediocrity. So it's really important that you not peanut butter. But having said that, everybody says, yeah, give me the peanut butter. Right? I know how to prioritize the product. Mine should be first. So how in the world would you do this in a principled way? So there's a framework that we use called the hierarchy of powers. And basically what it says is, look, if you're measuring the future potential of your product line, what you're really asking is, how much power is left, or how much power is in this product line? If I'm trying to judge its total future performance, and it turns out there's these 5 powers, and they're in hierarchical order, meaning the top one's the most important one, the bottom one's the least important. So the number one thing is category power. And notice what the footnote says: a category is defined as by a set of competitors. But if you're in, data lakes, or you're in, routed optical networking, or you're in, cybersecurity, or you're in whatever the heck you are, your category, if you're in a hot category, if you're on the Super Bowl, if you're in crypto, right? You people going, well, I think that's got a lot of future potential just on the category alone. On the other hand, if you said, well, I'm in desktop computers that are PCs, you think, well, that category is kind of long in the tooth. So that's category power. Company power is, okay, within that category, what is the status of your company? Is it a gorilla? Is it a chimp? Is it a monkey? And that's really important, because the profits from the category are not shared equally. The gorilla gets by far the best profit, as Apple and iPhones, for example. They get by far the most profit from the category. The number one chimp does pretty darn well. But after that, you got to kind of scrap. You got to get kind of scrappy. And so normally, if you have company power, you want to play really hard, because this is your time to win. Company power in a hot category. One of the challenges, by the way, is when you have company power in an old category, because you're the most powerful player, but the category is going away. That's a really hard time, because in the short term, you can still make quite a lot of money, but you can kind of see there's an end coming, and we're not prepared for it. So that can be a real challenge for product managers. Now, normally what you say is, when I might be in a good category, but I don't have company power, my company is not, it's not number 1 or number 2, it might be number 6. Okay, now what? Well, now this is where you talk about market power. And market is different from category, because it's defined as a set of customers, whereas categories is a set of competitors. So market power says, okay, look, you can't win the global market. The gorilla will beat you up, but you can find markets which are a little bit marginal to the category leaders, but for you can become what we call the gorilla in the niche. You can become powerful there. And so that's a really key strategy for product managers. When your product is a little bit flailing, or a little bit being challenged, or it needs to get its mojo back, we always say, run to the bowling alley, go into niche markets and develop really strong use case-based offerings, bring together the ecosystem in that segment around that use case, or that set of use cases, and build power in market segments. And then maybe you can come back out and challenge later for a broader power position. And then the fourth one, offer power, which is most of us as product managers, that's where we spend our lives. We're always matching up. But understand that if you're not in the right category with the right company, right market power, offer power alone can't do very much. I mean, it needs support. And then execution power, if you can't execute, none of the other powers matter. So in that sense, maybe you could argue it's the most important power. But in terms of the difference of the outcome, typically if you can't execute, people will find somebody who can. So I think maybe in that sense, it's the least important power. But here's the key idea. The more you can use this taxonomy to say, how powerful is my product, the more you should say there's a better case for investing in it asymmetrically. Well, my client said, well, Geoffrey, you're an English major, God bless you, but there's nothing quantitative here. We're engineers, we need something better. So what they did is they took the hierarchy powers, which are on the left. They said, we're going to build a scoring system. And so the first thing I said was, okay. They said, but they asked me, they said, well, how do you think we should weight the powers? And I said, well, we came up with these weights. And we debated these weights, by the way, a lot. This was their call, and they know their business better than I do. It's great. So 35, 25, 15, 15, 10. So it's a hierarchical thing. And the segment power for them, they are kind of more of a gorilla, so the segment power isn't really their strongest suit. So they said, for right now, we're not going to use segment power that strongly, but we're putting it in the taxonomy. But then what they actually did is they evaluated their product lines on the other 4. They didn't use segment power. They actually didn't have very good data for it. And frankly, it's hard to get good data on segment power, particularly if you're a large corporation. So I understand why they graded out. But then they said, okay, how do we score? And so they had 1 point if you're in the early market, 1 point for the Chasm, 3 for the bowling alley, 10 for the tornado, 5 for Main Street. And they went through the whole thing. And if you want to get this, Dan will be able to, you can get this deck if you want to get this thing. But here, let me show you what was kind of cool about this. So after they went through the whole thing and they scored it all up, they put all their product lines on the left. Now, I redacted that. But the point is, every one of those lines is a major product line. And they put the scores across and they added them all up and they did all the weighting and they got the score on the right. So you go, well, okay, okay. The good news is that's in priority order, at least in terms of power. But then to make it actionable, they did one last thing, which I think was great. And that was, we said, okay, look, how do you make this actionable? And here's what we said. We said, look, if you're in the top third of this priority set, you are part of our future. You're a power asset. We want to make sure we capitalize. We want to make hay while the sun shines. This is you. We are going to privilege you in this year's budgeting. We want to make sure you get funded first. We're not going to peanut butter. You guys, if we're going to peanut butter, you get the peanut butter and the bananas, and the honey and the special bread and the whatever. We're going to do it with you. Conversely, if you're at the bottom third of this list, we're going to rethink our commitment. Because we can't peanut butter everything. And by the way, so maybe we'll consolidate you, maybe we'll spin you off, maybe we'll figure out something. But what we're not going to do is continue funding you as if it was business as normal. We're not going to do that because we want to overfund the upper part. And then if you're in the middle, we're thinking, you guys need to either go up or down, right? And so we think, and maybe there's an intervention required here. For example, when I did that whole thing about run to the bowling alley and get market power, classically in that gray area, that's where you would say, maybe we should run a market power initiative and see if we can't get this engine revved up again by having a lot of success in a more local and contained place. So this ended up being a really, really powerful tool. And what it did is it let the team say, look, we're not squabbling one against one. We're doing top third, middle third, bottom third. And we're just holding ourselves accountable to doing what I think would technically be called asymmetrical resource allocation. So asymmetrical resource allocation means I am not going to peanut butter. Well, everybody says they're not going to peanut butter, but the fact is most everybody actually does peanut butter. Or else the loudest voice wins, or we have the hippo, the highest paid person, paid person's opinion does the unpeanut buttering. But this is a principled way for a team to have an open and transparent discussion about a very, very tough subject. So I think it's really important. I want to thank you for being patient with me up to this point.
Awesome, Jeff. Thank you so much for a great talk. That was awesome. And it's really cool to see the scoring from that company. I just got to share this real quick since you mentioned it several times for everybody here. Here's the quote from Yahoo: avoid the peanut butter strategy, right? So
Brad Garlinghouse, you betcha.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So right. Anytime I see, people, they prioritize and they just have, they do way more than 100% of the pie. I'm like, hey, don't peanut butter, don't do that. So great.
And by the way, it's socially very unpopular. I mean, the reason we because this is how we maintain social relationships, but it's disaster from the point of view of strategic resource allocation.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, it's like this egalitarian, everybody gets a little bit, and you don't, I like the term anti-peanut butter is asymmetric resource allocation. That's excellent. Okay. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom in your talk. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you always. And as I said, I think product managers do the heavy lifting for our industry, and God bless every single one of them. Okay. Take care, guys.
All right, Jeff. Thanks a lot. Take care.